Yeah, I can't tell you how surprised I was. I was sitting there and I was told, oh no, you have a long time before you're speaking. And all of a sudden, the special envoy has been introduced. What an incredible pleasure to be able to be here, and I thank you for getting us out of the part of town we were so we could have this incredible drive down here just a few moments ago. It was very, very beautiful, and I looked at all the people on the beach, and I said, what do they know that we don't? At any rate, this is a very, very important meeting. It's a very, very important gathering. And I know there are a lot of folks here from the private sector, which is critical. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the realities of finance and what we're struggling with right now, but the realities of the upside of investment and the importance of a meeting like this. And I appreciate enormously President Kenyatta. Thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you, Portugal, for hosting a terrific meeting and convening people to really talk about the possibilities and the prospects for life itself on this planet. So I'm going to begin just with a few comments that are on the big side and then narrow it down into the finance and realities. We have been at this, many of us, and I see the faces here, President Duque, others, for a long time. I was at the conference, I was there in 1988 when Jim Hansen testified that climate is happening. I went to Rio in 1992 and President George H.W. Bush signed an agreement that created the framework that brings us here. I was in Kyoto, I was in many of the COPs in between, and had the privilege of leading negotiations for Paris for the United States, as well as Glasgow now as Special Envoy. And I say all of that simply to give you a sense of the journey and what brings me to this point of a certain sense of reality that may be different from what some people see. But the urgency, my friends, the urgency of our getting this right, not in the next 10 years, 15, but now, in this decade, for the simple reason that this effort to respond to the crisis of climate is not driven by geopolitics, it's not driven by ideology, it's not driven by nation-state competition. It is driven by science, by mathematics, by physics, with some chemistry and biology, but basically science. And in 2018, the scientists warned us that we being people who can vote, people in positions of responsibility, peoples in governments, we had 12 years within which to make and implement the key decisions to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. Remember, I said worst consequences, not to avoid the crisis altogether. So what we decide to do in these next 8 years will govern the kind of world that we live in, and it will govern whether or not we can even achieve net zero by 2050. If we don't do enough between now and 2030, we don't achieve the 45% reduction that scientists have said is necessary to avoid the worst consequences. And if we don't achieve the 45% between now and 2030, you cannot achieve net zero by 2050, barring some technology that comes online that does direct air carbon capture and either utilization or storage so that we can avoid what we're putting up into the atmosphere. So that's what's driving this. That's why we're here. Because the oceans are integrally related to the climate crisis. The oceans are suffering principally because of the heat, 90% of the warming of the earth goes into the ocean. It is a great sink for carbon dioxide. And certain things we choose to do or don't choose to do have an impact on how the ocean responds. 51% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. Huge proportions of the protein people consume globally comes from the ocean. Vast numbers of jobs around the world depend on the ocean. So what happens to the ocean is integrally related to climate, and you cannot solve the problem of the oceans unless you solve the problem of climate. Why? Because there are two principal drivers of the problem of the ocean. One, the heat, and two, the particulates that fall from the sky and rain as a consequence of the global air quality, which carries greenhouse gases around the planet, and when it falls into the ocean as rain, it dissolves and becomes an increaser of the acidification of the ocean. And scientists are telling us that ultimately, clams, lobsters, all crustaceans, their skin will be affected by that acidity. If you took clams and put various clams in a group of trays with water, salt water in it, and you grow those clams from infant size, you will see, depending on the pH, the quality of acidity of that water, you'll see those clams grow to different sizes. That's how real this is. Nothing ideological. So, macro, we have to integrate what we're doing to deal with the climate crisis. And the truth is, folks, I hate to say this, but the world is not doing this fast enough. We're not moving fast enough. And what we know from the UN report on finance is that in order to transition our economies to clean energy economies, which is the solution to the climate crisis, what gives us the crisis? The way we propel machines, the way we propel cars, the way we drive motorcycles, or hackneys, and all these little jeepneys in India, wherever. That's the emissions. And the way we power our homes, heat our homes, light our homes. We have alternatives to fossil fuel, to coal, etc. But if we're not capturing the emissions, we're part of the problem. And right now, emissions are rising, despite Glasgow, despite the UN efforts. Last year, emissions went up 6%, coal use went up 9%. The exact opposite of what we agreed to do in Glasgow. So, why do we get frustrated a little bit? Why do I get frustrated at least, and other people I know? Because we can do better, because we have a better world looking at us, staring us in the face. A world where we can have clean energy. We don't have to do this the way we are. We're just doing business as usual because it's easy for a lot of people. But we have alternative renewable energy. We have almost $1 trillion of venture capital now chasing these solutions. Green hydrogen, direct air carbon capture, now chasing green hydrogen, electrolyzers that can come to scale and produce the hydrogen we need to be clean to drive our ships. We don't have to drive our ships with diesel. Maersk has made a decision, a business decision, that over the next years, immediately, the next 8 ships they buy are going to be carbon-free. Not lower carbon, carbon-free. Volvo, Ford Motor Company, have decided that they're going to buy 10% steel that is green now, despite the premium they will pay. And they will do this because it's good for business and good for the future, and they're making a commitment to be net zero by 2050. So up and down the economic food chain, companies are stepping up. As a result of Glasgow, we have 65% of global GDP now committed to keep 1.5 degrees alive as our goal. And those are big companies. Those are Google and Apple and FedEx and Salesforce and Volvo and Ford Motor Company and United Airlines, Delta Airlines, Apple. I mean, it's amazing what they're doing. They're sending demand signals to the marketplace, which all of you understand. We just need to do it faster. So we look at this challenge of creating this new economy. It's actually the most exciting economic challenge, the most exciting economic opportunity we have had in our lifetimes. It's the biggest market the world has ever known. 4.5 to 5 billion users of energy today in the world, and that's going to go up to 9 to 10 billion users in the next 10 years. I can tell you, because I represented Massachusetts in the United States Senate for 28 years, that includes MIT and Harvard and a bunch of other great institutions of learning. And it is clear that those companies understand and are moving in this direction. With fusion, with possibilities of new nuclear container-sized batteries that literally can be portable and will be able to light up a steel mill and run things in a clean way. This is the future. And all around the world, people are chasing this future. So if you're in business today, if I was in business today, I'd be sitting there and saying, I know where this market is going. The market's future is not going to be in fossil fuel, because it can't be. Unless we can abate it, mitigate it. And we know, because we've been trying for 30 years to mitigate coal, we can't, we haven't been able to. And we've been trying to mitigate oil, we don't do a great job of it. Gas, we do a little better. And clearly gas will be part of the transition. Why? Because gas is 50% cleaner immediately than oil or coal. And we need that 50%. So over the next 8 years, as we transition, we can use that 50% to meet what the scientists say is 45% reduction. But we have to go beyond that. What happens after 2030? After 2030, we have to get to net zero by 2050. And that means we need the private sector. And I keep saying this wherever I go in the world. No government has enough money to accelerate this transition as fast as we need to in order to make it. So how do we do it? Well, we have to be creative. We were able to do Bretton Woods in 1948 after World War II, and we put together the world in an economic system that worked for that world, but this is a different world, which is why Janet Yellen has now said we need to do a post-Bretton Woods meeting. We need to decide how the multi-development banks are going to get more funds, more ability to be able to accelerate the transition. And I believe we'll get there. I'm convinced we will get to a low-carbon, no-carbon economy, folks. What I can tell you is whether we will get there in time to avoid the worst consequences of the crisis. And that depends a lot on you and on the outcomes of this kind of meeting. The UN Finance Report has told us this transition, which is achievable, will need to get about $2.5 to $4.5 trillion per year for the next 30 years. We're obviously not close to that. Now, when I took on this job, I immediately went to find where we're going to get the money. So I went to the 6 largest banks in the United States. I went to Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citibank, Wells Fargo, State Street, and Bank of America. And I said, how much are you guys willing to invest in this transition to help us get where we need to go? And they got their pencils out, they did their homework, they came back, and they publicly announced they are prepared. If you're in business today, this is important. They are ready to invest $4.16 trillion over the next 8 years to make this transition meet the 2030 goal, but that's an investment. It's not concessionary funding. And so the key is, how do we create a finance structure that can accelerate? I was talking to Minister Luhut of Indonesia today, because we're working with Indonesia specifically. Why? Because Indonesia is one of those countries of the 20 largest economies in the world that need to transition fast. Think about this. 20 countries equal 80% of all the emissions in the world. 20 countries. We met about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, in a virtual meeting in the White House with President Biden, with the leaders of those countries. President Duque took part in it, others. And we talked about how do we accelerate the transition? Because those 20 countries are key. And I told you a moment ago, 65% of global GDP has already laid out what we call an NDC, a national plan, to achieve 1.5 degrees. And Fatih Birol at the International Energy Agency told the world that if everybody did what they said they'd do in Glasgow, the world's temperature increase would be held to 1.8 degrees by 2050. That's incredible. You know what that tells me? Not that we can stop at 1.8 degrees. It tells me we can win this battle. Because that's just with 65% of GDP. If we can bring the other 35% on, we can get there. And that's what we're working at with Indonesia, with Mexico, where President Lopez Obrador, who I visited with 4 times in the last months, who came around and said, you know what? We're going to invest in refurbishing our electrical, our hydro. We're going to invest in deploying renewables. We're going to try to create a capacity for Mexico to provide power to Latin America, Central America, to US, Canada, California, literally. And it's doable. That changes the whole equation for all of you who are thinking about investing, and particularly ultimately thinking about the blue economy. Let me try to get to that quickly so that in fairness I move along here. But the point is you have to view this in the macro in order to understand the full measure of the ingredients that have to enter into your business decision. Now, it's not concessionary funding, but there has to be some concessionary funding because we need to try to help you de-risk those investments. Some of them de-risk automatically. If you're producing a revenue-producing product of some kind, well, you can get the de-risking fairly easy. For instance, power. You produce power, clean power, through wind farm or solar panel distribution or batteries or whatever, you're going to have revenue. That's financeable. And much of this is going to create bankable deals that you can go to the marketplace. Now, you may not be looking at 100x. It may not be the next Google or Apple. But guess what? There was a time when people were pretty happy with 6, 7, 12%. And that was sufficient for fiduciary responsibility, for public money, for pensions, for retirement. So we've got to think wisely about this. And what we're trying to do now is put together blended finance mechanisms where we can act as an intermediary and sit down with the country and try to target some of their coal plants and say, how many plants are you willing to take out of commission? And what would you replace them with? And if that's renewables or nuclear or whatever it may be, those ought to be financeable because they have a revenue stream for the energy that they're providing. So the blue economy actually is also a place where there's a mix. Some of the things we need to do in terms of the blue economy need to be concessionary. And that will excite the capacity of a profit-making enterprise or something that just needs to get close to that to be able to invest and be part of that transition. In Palau, we held an ocean conference earlier this year. The president of Palau was here, and he's played a key role in helping to think through the island states, the vulnerable states, how do we help them? Well, there's a way to restore habitat that will then bring value to that habitat and bring capacity to be able to invest. And that's why we need the blended finance, because we may need to come in and help some of these places to be able to create the climate, no pun intended, to be able to invest the private capital. Private capital is almost always going to look for either the fastest return on investment or the safest return on investment, or a combination of those two. That's just how it works. And we in public life have to be thoughtful and acknowledge the realities of how it does behave. You're not going to be able to make this happen and get the private sector at the table to the degree we need the private sector if we're sitting there in a punitive way and driving people away. We have to be able to do things, and we have to do them differently from the way we've done them in the past. I'll give you an example. In my country, we can't take 10 years to get a decision on whether or not we can site a wind farm or a solar farm of some kind. And we've just got to accelerate decision making. And I was talking with Portuguese business people yesterday at Ambassador Levine's residence here, the embassy, with some of your folks in business, and they were saying, it takes 5 years to get a decision. Obviously, the regulatory process is going to have to speed up and keep awareness of the importance of these times. So, in Palau, we got 400 commitments on this small island state in the Pacific from 70 different nations that came in. And $16 billion of public money was committed to try to help the blue economy to move faster. That's why it's worth your importance to put your time and energy into thinking about this. Because I'll be very precise on specific climate commitments. There were 89 commitments worth $4.9 billion that will help deal with climate and open up blue economy opportunities. There were sustainable fisheries initiatives, some 60 commitments to help create sustainable fisheries for $668 million of committed funding. There were sustainable blue economy initiatives of various kinds, which I urge you to take a look at. On the sustainable blue economies, there were 89 commitments, $5.2 billion. And there were marine protected areas, 58 commitments made, $1.3 billion. And maritime security, which is important for the safety of whatever whatever your investment may be, $358 million. And maritime pollution reduction, which is important quality, $3.3 billion, folks. So you're not alone. If you're an investor, if you're a business, you are going to have unprecedented support that is only going to grow. And I think that kind of comfort level that can be given to the private sector is very rare and very important. You're not being asked to be a solo venture capitalist flyer on your own who's out there putting your money at risk without anything else happening in the marketplace to secure that funding. So I think there's a huge economy waiting us, unbelievable opportunities that will grow as we go forward. And my judgment is that what we need now is innovative, scalable finance with insurance products, which some of the big insurance companies are now thinking about, which can help de-risk these deals. Now, we've always faced risk in the marketplace. Political risk, currency risk, weather risk. I mean, there are all kinds of different risks. But I think there's an opportunity here to grab the greatest level of mitigation of those risks that I've ever seen in the course of my dealing with these kinds of issues. So my friends, it's going to take all of us to achieve our goal here. Governments, insurers, banks, civil society, and we need to have leaders like President Kenyatta and President Duque and others who are prepared to put their credibility on the line because they understand what the stakes are for humanity. And they also understand the extraordinary economic opportunity that's waiting us. I'll tell you what, I went out to California the other day because I really wanted to understand better what the technology possibilities may be. And I went to Google X and I saw powder that was literally being taken out of the air in the form of carbon and transitioned in their process into this ingredient, which will be utilized to do something. I'm not sure what. Maybe part of roads or buildings or new steel girders, new cement, something. But it's there. going to happen. I also saw direct air carbon capture in other forms. I saw a battery that is probably a 100-hour battery. That's a game changer. 4 days battery coming to utility scale that has the ability to change how you balance your energy grid, which alters the amount of fossil fuel you need to depend on to keep the balance of that grid. That's going to happen. Green hydrogen, game changer, obviously. And there are many other kinds. So I think we're living in a most extraordinary moment. The only question is, do we have the courage and conviction as leaders to open up these economic opportunities sufficiently that the private sector can rush in? There's no way, as I said, any government will put up the money we need for this. It's in the trillions of dollars. But I'll tell you what, whoever comes up with that long-term battery storage is going to be richer than Jeff Bezos. Whoever comes up with the ability to be able to change this equation, and someone will, I guarantee you, with the amount of money now chasing these opportunities, that is the future. So I'm happy to join with my colleagues in government to welcome you to the future. I'm glad that we're meeting here in Portugal, which has always been a place of discovery. We just passed that extraordinary expanse of water which ships departed from to explore the world and define the future years and years ago. Hopefully this meeting will help us define the future even further. Thank you for the privilege of sharing.